Gavin Esler is a multi-award-winning journalist, broadcaster and best-selling author. He's interviewed everyone from presidents to prime ministers, princes to pop stars. You've probably seen him hosting various shows on BBC News, including the flagship show, Newsnight. He's got a cracking new podcast series out called The Big Steal, which is all about big-time corruption at the Kremlin. Gavin Esler, welcome to the Pod 20.
Very good to talk to you. Very good.
I want to talk about the podcast a little bit later on, but first of all, I want to find out a little bit more about you. You were born in Glasgow, grew up in Edinburgh. Tell me about your early life and how it shaped who you are today.
Well, I was born into a council house in Clydebank on the outskirts of Glasgow, number 66 Clarence Street, for those who know the area, atop of Cobowie Hill, in a house where we shared with my grandmother, my mother and father, and two aunties. So it was a very small house, and in an area where the shipyards were closing, and it was somewhat difficult. And at age 3 weeks, I nearly died and had an operation in an NHS hospital. And from the moment that I was old enough to notice that I got a scar on my belly, my grandmother used to tell me, you know, you're very lucky, son, because if you'd been born in my generation before the NHS was founded, you'd be dead. Because nobody could have afforded to have the operation. So if there was one thing that sort of stuck with me, it's absolutely that, which is that the NHS has got, its problems, it's got its difficulties with coronavirus, it's got its flaws. I don't think it's very bureaucratic, unfortunately. We've got some great people in it, but at the very top, it's not very well organized. But those kind of things, those things that we do together make our country great. And if we can continue to do that, that is how Britain will prosper in the future. And if we fail to do that, despite, clapping nurses on a Thursday night is great, it's lovely, but we should pay them more, and doctors and everybody else in the health service, in my view.
So how did you go from that background to a career in, first of all, in newspaper journalism, because you were the first one in your family to go to university?
Yeah, I was very lucky. My parents moved to Edinburgh, and I managed to pass an exam to get scholarships in a great school in Edinburgh. And then I was going to be a doctor because of actually what I just told you about nearly dying age 3 weeks. And the very last minute, I decided, I'm doing a lot of writing. I want to be a writer. I want to be a journalist. And I went off to university and did English and then Irish literature. So I decided that was absolutely what I wanted to do. I wanted to write, communicate, and I didn't actually think I wanted to be in television. I thought I'd prefer newspapers. So I got a job with what was called Thompson Newspapers at the time, and they offered me a job in Edinburgh on the Scotsman. And I said, I grew up there. It's a lovely place, but it's a little bit boring. Can I go to Glasgow? Can I go to Belfast? Because it's the nearest to Glasgow I could get. And so I went to Belfast during the Troubles. Which was, Belfast is an amazing place. I love it dearly. I go back there several times a year, and I'm actually should be going this summer, but I don't think I will be now because of coronavirus.
Any hairy moments reporting during the Troubles?
Yeah, one or two. I had my car hijacked in a almost comic situation because I used to, when there was a big funeral in West Belfast, an IRA funeral, and I was filming there and was going up to a monastery to interview a local priest when a complete lunatic from a Protestant paramilitary came in and started shooting at people in the funeral. And it all went completely crazy. And anyway, I went to, with my film crew, to interview the priest as we were supposed to be doing. Finished doing the interview and came out, and there were, how can I put this? There were four men who I had reason to believe were members of an Irish Republican paramilitary organization who stopped us as we were driving out. And they said, "We need your car." And I said, "You don't hijack journalists' cars." And one of them said to me, "This is not your car. Your car is a blue Ford. This is a hire car. It's a commercial vehicle." So we had I couldn't make this. We had a disagreement over whether I was driving a commercial vehicle or whether I wasn't. And for various reasons, which I won't entirely go into, I lost the argument because the car keys had disappeared from the car by that time. So they got in the car and drove off. Yeah, that was interesting. Looking back in it, it was almost comic to have this kind of, you can't do that. It's a commercial vehicle.
Yeah, it sounds like a Monty Python sketch where you're debating something so the minutiae of the situation rather than the gravity of the situation.
When Belfast is erupting all around us, and but looking back on it, that's one of the things about Belfast and Northern Ireland and Ireland in general that I like. I was never directly, personally threatened by people who did some very, very bad things. And it was a very, very, very odd to have that kind of confrontation with people who were up to no good, really.
You said you were filming on that one. Was that after you'd got with the BBC then?
No, I was. That was for the BBC.
Yeah. So how did you go from newspapers to the BBC?
Well, I got a job with the BBC in Belfast, and then it was kind of interesting because the BBC has always been very nervous about Northern Ireland. It's very, very difficult to cover because it's a very divided place. And when even British government ministers come in, they make such a fool of themselves sometimes. I mean, we had Karen Bradley, the most recent Northern Ireland secretary, who admitted she didn't understand that unionists and nationalists didn't vote for the same people. I mean, after 30 years and 3,500 deaths, it's just extraordinary. So because I had some local knowledge, because I'd been there for a while, when Newsnight wanted some coverage from there, I did some stories for them. They liked it. And I got a job there and then moved on to the United States.
Yeah, you were the chief North American correspondent based in Washington during the George Bush Sr. and the Clinton administration. How different is American politics now?
Well, I spent 1 year of my life on one lie, and the lie was I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. That was Bill Clinton. Now we have a president who, and don't take my word for it, if you log in and look at Washington Post Trump lies, you'll find that he's told about 18,000 lies in 1,100 days of the presidency. He started by telling, by their calculation, about a dozen lies, falsehoods, or uncorrected mistruths or misstatements a day. And he's more recently, since he's seeking re-election and coronavirus, doing more than 23 a day. So that's 1 an hour. I mean, you know, frankly, the man is a workaholic.
Well, you lived there for a long time. You must have got a feel of the vibe. Was it a surprise to you when Trump got in?
No, because to blow my own trumpet, in the late 1990s, at the end of the Clinton period, when everything was going all right, you know, unipolar world, America was the one superpower, GDP per capita was huge, home ownership was up, unemployment was way down, everything from hip hop to Hollywood movies had taken the world, you know, American culture and Apple and Google and so on. Everything was going well. And I traveled around a total of 48 states, and everywhere I went, basically middle income people said, things are terrible. I can't make ends meet. It was best summed up by a cop in Annapolis, Maryland, who told me, Bill Clinton says he's created 11 million new jobs. He has, and I've got 5 of them. Actually, I've only got 4, but my wife's got 1. What he meant was he worked for 5 days in a row as a cop, and then on his 3 days off shift, he worked as a security guard for each of those days for different companies, because you know the social and economic divisions in America were quite obvious then. So I wrote a book called The United States of Anger, saying why is it in this great country that I love, and everything I read about it seems to be going well, but everything I hear about it when I go around America and the kind of anecdotal is not good. And so while it didn't include Trump in it, the anger that I talked about in the book is the kind of thing that, you know, things aren't going well. What's gone wrong here is why Trump is president of the United States. And looking back on it, I didn't predict it. I'm not saying that, but I did say in the book that if something isn't done to fix the way ordinary people, by ordinary people I mean just, you know, the average person in the street in America, who are the most hospitable, decent people, but they are incredibly worried about healthcare, lack of, fact that if you get sick, you may lose your job, you lose your health insurance, and you lose your home. You know, for all our problems in the United Kingdom, we don't have that.
Yeah, I think it's the number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States is not being able to pay your medical bills, which in a Western society is disgraceful for that to be a statistic.
Yeah, and also, you know, the amount they spend per head on healthcare is almost twice what we spend. One of the things I used to say, if I really wanted to annoy Trump supporters, which I do sometimes, is to say, you realize that in terms of children dying around the time of birth, the United States record is worse than Cuba's. And then they usually go off on one. And I say, no, I'm not making this up. If you want to check, I got it from the CIA website. Have a look. I haven't looked recently, but the CIA does a world comparison of healthcare outcomes, among other things. And if you look at Cuba and perinatal mortality rates, you'll find out that Cuba is doing better than the richest country in the world.
Yeah, because Cuba has full cradle-to-grave healthcare service, doesn't it? Yeah.
And
but Americans seem to be in denial about the cost of healthcare there. They think we pay a lot more and our taxes are sky high. When I first started out in radio, I was a disc jockey on a breakfast show, and I subscribed to an American comedy service where they wrote jokes for you, and I ended up not being able to use any of them because they were so American. One of the jokes was it was when Hillary during the Clinton administration was talking about bringing in a universal health care, or at least something better than they had. And the joke was, if you think health care is expensive now, wait till it's free. They were basically saying that insurance premiums would go up, you know, and that told me a lot about America at the time. Yeah.
Well, with the George Bush Jr. administration, after Guantanamo Bay was opened up, I was interviewing a lawyer who advised George W. Bush about Guantanamo Bay, and something went wrong with the camera, and we stopped anyway. And during the break, he turned to me. This is a very, very smart, very, very expensive, well-connected Washington, D.C. lawyer. And he turned to me and he said, "Tell me about your death panels." And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And he said, "You know, the people in England who decide whether you live or die." And I'm thinking, I really don't know. What he'd heard on Fox News was that the what's it called, National Institute for Clinical Excellence, NICE, which is the people who say this drug is worth the NHS spending money on. This one, maybe the outcomes aren't so good. We won't license that one yet. Fox News called them death panels.
Wow. Yeah, that's what you're dealing with. How has the style of political interviewing changed with broadcasters?
I don't know. I think there's lots and lots of styles. I mean, I think personally, the idea that everybody who appears in front of you as an interviewer should be treated as if they were a war criminal, which one or two broadcasters managed to do, is just ludicrous. Because if everybody's a war criminal, actually nobody's a war criminal. You should save that kind of attitude for war criminals. On the other hand, the kind of defensive game played by some politicians because they're briefed on how to actually say nothing. Yeah. So when you get politicians who say something, or even, you know, coronavirus is a good example. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a conservative politician, actually, a couple of days ago. And he was saying, we were talking about coronavirus, and he was saying, you know, if the government admitted mistakes and said, we never had come across this, we didn't really think it was going to happen. We have some plans, but we needed to dust them off, and we were slow. People would forgive them. This is a forgiving country. We get that. If you said you've made a mistake broadcasting, or if I say something silly with you, I will apologize. And most people will say that's fine. So it's not just gotcha journalism. It is the failure of some politicians to recognize that as grown-ups, we're prepared to listen to people who've made mistakes and forgive them. Bill Clinton wouldn't have been president, continue to be president, if he hadn't said, look, I did something really stupid and I am so sorry. And he got away with it.
I think Tony Blair's probably the classic example. All he has to do is say, look, at the time, with the evidence I had in front of me, it looked like the right decision. Now, obviously, it was a bad decision. But he won't say that. He keeps just sticking to the thing that it was the right thing to do.
And I think part of it is, and journalists are partly to blame in this, because of the gotcha thing, and because some journalists keep going on and on and on, as I say, as if everybody is a terrible person. Most people I know in politics, most of them, and I know quite a lot of people in all main political parties, they didn't get in to get rich, because they could have been richer doing something else. They didn't get into politics to lie to us. They didn't. They genuinely didn't. But somehow, some of the ones who rise to the top of political parties seem to get there by not always telling the truth and not always being terribly competent, actually, either. But they are loyal. And that's one of the flaws, it seems to be, with the two-party system. How do you... I just done a book called Brexit Without the Bullshit, and I've done a book tour now in abeyance because of coronavirus. And I cannot tell you at how many meetings, public meetings, somebody has said, so how do you get to be Chris Grayling? To which I'll let Mr. Grayling answer that one.
In 2012, you published a great book, Lessons from the Top, How Leaders Succeed Through the Power of Stories. What are these stories? For anyone who's not read the book, what are these stories and why are they so important?
Well, what happened was I was trying to think. I'd met so many leaders, Blair, Clinton, Thatcher, Angela Merkel, Dolly Parton, who features quite heavily in the book because she's a great storyteller. Lots and lots of people. And I tried to figure out, how is it that some people connect and some people don't? I mean, there's some very bright people who go into politics and they don't quite connect with the general public. And I realized that there's three basic stories, and every single one of the successful leaders tell those same three stories. And they are, who am I as a person? Who are we as a group? And then if you're still listening, they can tell you where we're going with this, what that leader is going to do. So, for example, Mrs. Thatcher, I'm just the grocer's daughter from Grantham. Bill Clinton, I'm the boy from Hope. And Donald Trump, I'm the greatest billionaire business person in the entire world. Now, this can be entirely fictitious, or but it's always only part of the story. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher was many more things than the grocer's daughter from Grantham, but that's the story she wanted to tell. Bill Clinton, when I first bumped into him, and literally bumped into him, he was out jogging, he said, I'm just the boy from Hope, Arkansas being the town that he came from. Now, there's many other things you could say about these leaders, but that's the one little nugget they wanted to get in your brain. And then who are we? Well, Mrs. Thatcher redefined both the Conservative Party and the country, and Bill Clinton, we're not the old Democrats, we are the new Democrats. And Tony Blair did the same thing, and others. And then if you're still listening, as I say, you might listen to their policies. And one of the problems with some politicians who lose, Hillary Clinton's one, Ed Miliband's another, whatever their greatness or otherwise of the policies, the third bit, if they haven't really sold you the idea of who they are in a way that you like. Everybody knew who Hillary Clinton was, but she was very divisive and many people didn't like her. I personally don't think people really knew who Ed Miliband was. He's a very bright guy. Maybe he would have been a good prime minister or a bad prime minister, but nobody listened to his 300 policies or whatever they were until he properly connected. And so that's what the book's about, which is, as a result of that book, I continue to do lots of speaking to businesses in particular, because a lot of businesses are trying to figure out what their identity actually is. And quite often the chief executives want to discuss that as well, because all leadership positions are quite difficult. And people in business have very much woken up to the fact that just to be able to do a good job isn't good enough. I mean, one of the things I say, this came from a banker, a CEO of a major bank, who I was discussing this with. He asked me to come in and chat to him, and he said, I get it. If hard skills were everything, then Spock would have been commander of the USS Enterprise. Said,
Brilliant.
that's great. I'm going to put that in the book the next time I rewrite it.
Was that Jeremy Corbyn's problem, that he didn't have a great story?
No, I think he had a story. I think it was a story that just didn't connect with it connected with some people. He's a bit of a rebel. He's always said the same thing. Other people looking at exactly the same story said, yeah, he's always said the same thing since 1970s, but what has he actually done? So I think that was his story. He had a story, but it was one that didn't connect with, obviously, the vast majority of the British people. Otherwise, he'd have been Prime Minister.
What's Boris's story?
Well, I'll tell you what Boris's story is. Boris's story is kind of, to misquote Oscar Wilde, it's the importance of not being earnest. I may not be very good. I've actually not achieved anything. There are no bridges I've ever built. I bought water cannon that never got fired, that got sold for scrap. I do talk a lot of rubbish, but I'm quite entertaining. I think that's his story. And by the way, I have a classics degree from Oxford, so I must somehow be smart. Although, I don't want to deride classics degrees. Being bright at a dead language isn't the greatest achievement of humanity, it seems to me.
Did you watch him last night? How did he do last night? Do you want to talk about that quickly?
Well, what can one say? Boris Johnson is someone who wrote two versions of what he wanted to do about Brexit in a Daily Telegraph column. One, he was in favor of Brexit, and one he was against. And at the very last moment, he decided he was in favor of Brexit when that column got published. Last night, he seemed to have two versions of what we should do, and they were both in the same speech. You can go to work, but you can't go to public transport. You can go to work if you can't work at home. Dentists can't work at home. Hairdressers can't work at home. I mean, I leave it to everybody to look through it, but it was an absolute muddle, and the sort of banging on the desks and the bluster doesn't work, I'm afraid. And we need more than that. And also, one other thing, how slow have we been? Again, if the government said, look, we were slow off the mark, this has been very difficult. I personally feel sorry for Matt Hancock. I mean, he's made mistakes, but he's under tremendous pressure. And he's not entirely helped by the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I was in New Zealand. I arrived there on the 14th of March, and 2 days later, all overseas visitors had to quarantine for 2 weeks.
Well, now
we haven't done it.
Yeah, I know, but
and they're coming out of lockdown now. Yeah.
Yeah, but now we are quarantining people coming to our country when we have got the worst record, it would appear, in Western Europe, when we are an exporter of coronavirus, not an importer.
Yeah.
I mean, we could go through a whole lot of things. And what does anger me, actually, to go back to the start of our conversation, is as someone whose life was saved by the NHS, I've got a daughter whose life was saved by the NHS. We've all got friends whose life was saved by the NHS. I've got friends who are doctors and nurses and others. And the cleaners and everybody in the NHS does a really hard job. But you could say these are lions led by donkeys. I'm sorry, they've been put into positions where, unfortunately, health workers are at risk because they're doing the job that we want them to do, which is to treat us when we're sick. And that is disgraceful.
Now, you are pro-EU. In fact, you stood for an EU party in 2019. How do you think the EU has handled the corona crisis? Because I always thought, as this dinky little island, we would be better off joining up with all of our neighbours, and together we'll be better. I mean, the Concorde is an example. Airbus is another example, to use two aviation examples of what great things we can do when we get together with our European partners. How do you think the EU has dealt with the coronavirus? Because I haven't seen any evidence of them doing anything, and that might be just because I don't know, but I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, let me back up. I'm very critical of the European Union, and one of the reasons I'm critical of the European Union is that basically Mrs. Thatcher was very, very tough on the EU, but she was always in the room. She was always the best informed leader. She always knew what everybody else was doing. And she drove the EU in the direction that suited Britain's interests, and other countries too. We've lost that ever since David Cameron made, in my view, very silly mistakes about links with the European People's Party, which is the main right-wing, centre-right group in Europe. Britain lost a great deal of influence. So one of the things that saddens me, and as somebody who's very critical of quite a lot about the EU, is that it would be a better institution had Britain played its part in the past 10 years, which we haven't. We could have done a lot better. And if you look back at the Thatcher period and look at these very, very tough, smart diplomats that we had there, some of whom I got to know when I was working there for the BBC, covering European summits, we just lost it. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that many EU countries are doing better than we are. I mean, you know, Italy has had a terrible time, but we had a month to catch up. Ireland, I was talking to an Irish radio station recently, and they were basically saying to me, wait a minute, on March the 10th, we cancelled the St. Patrick's Day parade, the biggest event in Ireland, obviously, on the 17th of March. You, meaning Britain, went ahead with a Stereophonics concert, Liverpool playing Atletico Madrid, and the Cheltenham Gold Cup. What were you, expletive deleted, thinking? And so, you know, we can criticize each other and we have to learn from each other. And I'm sure the EU has got much, you know, that one can criticize. But individual EU countries, when I look at it, looking at Germany, I was just looking before we started our conversation. You can go on Deutschland.eu, which is a English language website for the German government, where they tell you some of the things they're doing. Some of the things they're doing is they're putting money into digitization for schools. So schools, if we have a lockdown going a lot longer, will have much better equipment so the teachers can do what we're doing, which is talk on Zoom. They are putting money into orchestras and to theaters and to German culture because they think this is an important thing to cheer us all up when we get through this. Now, we are still on the kind of, maybe you should go to work, maybe you shouldn't, you might be able to sunbathe a bit more with your grandmother, but only your grandmother and not your granddad. I mean,
yeah,
frankly,
that is individual countries, but surely the EU, because this is a global pandemic, shouldn't the EU have come together at some stage? I mean, I'm disappointed. I just wondered if you're disappointed that they didn't kind of step in and say, right, we can show why the EU is important. I think it was a missed opportunity.
Perhaps I don't know. I genuinely don't know what more they could do beyond. For example, I don't know about coronavirus, but I do know about cancer because I chaired the European Cancer Conference just over a year ago in Brussels, and they brought together basically doctors and clinicians from all over the European Union, including Britain, to talk about what can we learn from you and what can you learn from us, because cancer and coronavirus, and you might say climate change and a lot of other things, are not national problems, they're international problems, and we can do better by working together. Now that's always been my view, but if they're open for criticism, I don't know, I haven't really looked at it.
You've been critical of the way the media covered the Brexit campaign. Last year, the Huffington Post reported that you said TV news should stop giving airtime to the village idiots of Brexit. Who are the village idiots of Brexit?
Well, they know who they are. They absolutely know who they are. My point was this: it was a much longer interview than that, and I'll tell you what I said. I said, look, Michael Gove said the British people have had enough of experts. When Michael Gove gets a toothache, he does not go to the village idiot. He goes to a dentist. When Michael Gove gets sick, he goes to a doctor. He doesn't go to the bloke in the pub. So why is it when we have people who know how you negotiate trade treaties, or who know about climate change, was my other example, we then go to somebody who doesn't know anything about it, who has an opinion about it, but it is not based on any facts or any knowledge. And I said that would be the equivalent of interviewing the village idiot. So that was how it came about. It was somewhat truncated in the version that was printed, but the basic point remains the same. We have more Nobel Prizes in one college in Cambridge University than all of China. We are a very, very, very bright country with lots of really smart people. But I would suggest to you politely that we don't have all the best geniuses actually running our government.
Okay.
I'll just keep it like that.
Is it an issue with particularly the BBC and their obsession with balance, that they think that maybe, or they try to portray that every argument has two sides, when sometimes one side of the argument is an argument and the other side of the argument is someone who's batshit crazy? They give the same credibility to, in your words, the village idiot.
Well, you know, when I started in Northern Ireland as a journalist, balance was you'd have a unionist and a nationalist, and they would have an argument, or we'd have conservative and Labour, or in Scotland you might have a nationalist and somebody who's a unionist. That's easy, actually. That's great, and that's very important. But when you have somebody who is one of the members of the UN Committee on Climate Change and a climate scientist telling you that we're not entirely sure of everything, but we can tell you that global warming is real and it is going to be dangerous. And you have someone like Nigel Lawson, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, but had a view that this other person was wrong. You have to ask yourself, you know, why is that balanced? Is that seriously balanced? If you went to the dentist and you said you need a filling, and then you came to me and said, I haven't a clue what I'm talking about, but I'll have a look. And produce pliers, would you probably go back to the dentist? I think you would. And so I get the idea of balance, but it has to be rethought in terms also of what service are you doing to the viewer, balancing somebody who knows what they're talking about with somebody who just has an opinion but doesn't know what they're talking about. And that can be very difficult to sort out. I think all broadcasters know that that's a problem, but they understand they've got to think about it.
Yeah, I forget who it was that said there's a difference between simple and easy. Just because it's a simple solution doesn't mean it's easy. Yeah, so let's talk about the podcast then. The Big Steal, the story of the largest theft of the biggest country's resources by a clique of men associated with the Kremlin. First of all, why did you decide to make this a podcast rather than a TV documentary or a book?
Partly because I was asked. I was talking to Fresh Air Production, who are a great podcast company that won lots and lots and lots of awards. And we were talking about, there was a court judgment a couple of years ago about Yukos. Yukos was the biggest oil company in Russia. And essentially, it was, and this is the court judgment, it was stolen from the people who owned it, the investors and so on. And the proceeds sort of disappeared into people associated with the Kremlin and others. And the initial judgment was that there should be, at a court in the Netherlands, these folk should be compensated by the Russian state for $50 billion. So I'd never really heard of this, and we talked about it. And as it happens, during the year where we were making the podcast series, this all went to appeal. And in February 2020, that judgment was upheld. Now, I don't think Vladimir Putin is going to raid the Kremlin piggy bank and start paying out $50 billion. But that gives you a sense of some of the things that have been going on in Russia since the fall of communism. So we talked to a number of people, everybody from former chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov, to Russian opposition figures, to people involved in Yukos. And the other part of that story is that Yukos tells the story in a way of how Russia went from communism to what we call a kleptocracy, because so much money has been stolen. And one figure at the center of that is a guy called Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who lives in London now in exile. But you may remember him because he was the guy who transformed Yukos from essentially state-owned assets to one of the biggest oil companies in the world. And he ended up in a cage, in a courtroom in Russia on a show trial. And the reason he ended up in the cage was because on TV, along with a group of very rich Russians, there was a big TV discussion with Vladimir Putin about how to take the country forward. And Khodorkovsky, very unwisely, as it turned out, said, Mr. President, you know, there's a lot of people who are corrupt in your government. It'd be a great idea if you do something about it. And 3 months or 4 months later, he did do something about it. He put Khodorkovsky in a cage and he went through the trial process. And Khodorkovsky, I think, served 9 years in jail and is now out. So we pieced all this together and decided that Russia is such a great country with such brilliant people, but has gone on a very, very strange path. And it is very dangerous for its neighbors. It's not a great neighbor. If you're in Crimea, you were annexed. If you're Ukraine, you've been attacked. If you're flying over Russia, MH17, a Malaysian airliner, was shot down. If you're living in London, you might wonder why Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned by polonium. Or if you live in Salisbury, what happened to the Skripals when there was a nerve agent that was used and fortunately it didn't kill them. So we tried to piece all those bits together, but in terms of true crime, because it is possibly the biggest crime in terms of money ever. And some of the people we've talked to have said that you're talking about the richest person in the world. No, not Jeff Bezos, not Amazon, but Vladimir Putin.
Is Putin a criminal?
Well, he's not been convicted as far as I know. In fact, he is trying to arrange things so that he may stay in power till 2036 from 2020. So, he's the most powerful Russian leader since Stalin. Stalin, of course, was never a criminal, but he did do some things which were courts able to review Stalin's history, they might assume that he might convict him. So Putin has never been convicted of anything, so he is not technically a criminal. But the evidence of him being involved in what is a pattern of corruption is quite great. And Garry Kasparov said to me, every state has its mafia. In Russia today, unfortunately, the mafia has its own state.
What's Putin's story?
Well, Putin's fascinating, actually. He is quite an extraordinary person. He grew up fairly poor in the Soviet Union. He joined the KGB. He rose to become a colonel and was based in Dresden. Now, Dresden was not a glamour posting in the Cold War. And one of those we talked to, Mark Galeotti, who's studied Putin, written a book about Putin. I said to him, but he was a kind of James Bond figure. He said, no, he wasn't James Bond. He was more like Miss Moneypenny. He wrote a lot of, now, he said that, I didn't say that. But he then went back to St. Petersburg, to Leningrad, and was a political fixer, was underestimated by many of the people that he worked with. They knew he was very effective at doing things, but they kind of thought he was a backroom boy. And then because they underestimated him, perhaps, and because he's very smart, he's very tough, he's very ruthless, and he's also a judoku. Judo is his big thing. And he's very often used his enemy's strength against them, including the West, frankly. I mean, one of the reasons that I was intrigued by this was the extent to which our information is corrupted or may be corrupted by sources in Russia. And it affects, as we know, things that were on the record. Hillary Clinton's emails just happened to come out during the US presidential election campaign.
And there was nothing in them.
Yeah, and it was, well, yeah, I looked at them. It's not quite, have you put the cat out kind of things, but it wasn't all that interesting, but it helped cost her the presidency. And what was interesting was, if you go back through the history of the KGB has always been interested in disinformation. Keep your enemies, this is where the judo thing comes in, off balance. And so if you don't really, Hannah Arendt, the German writer and philosopher, once wrote, the totalitarian mindset is not that of a confirmed Nazi or a confirmed communist. It is of those people who cannot anymore tell the difference between fact from truth or fact from falsehood or fiction. And I think that is actually one of the dilemmas of our age. When you hear or see something, is it fake news? Is this right? Can this be true? What is going on here? And that keeps us all off balance. And that's something which democracies have to be particularly careful about.
The podcast makes the point that Russia's trying to subvert democracy worldwide. Why do they want to do that?
It's not because they want, I think, I've talked to lots and lots of people about this. It's not because any particular outcome from this person, this candidate, or that person is the advisable outcome. It's because they want to keep democracies confused. And it's quite easy. Well, to give you an example, I went to the cyber warfare conference, which a lot of NATO people, a lot of cyber experts, a lot of counterintelligence people go there. It was in Estonia. Estonia was cyber attacked by Russia about 15 years ago. And what they did was, there was a political row, which we needn't get into, but the point was that they brought down the banking system and made telecommunications somewhat difficult. And it was a kind of trial run. And since then, NATO, for example, has tried to harden our abilities to counteract this kind of thing. And I talked to a couple of people who were NATO observers at this conference, and one of them said to me, I said to him, are we actually in cyber terms at war with Russia? And he said, just because we're not at war with Russia doesn't mean to say Russia is not at war with us, which was quite an interesting comment. And another one said, we can harden our systems very easily. In other words, we can perhaps prevent ways in which people can get into our computers, to put it simply. But we have to also harden our minds to some of the nonsense that we see on the internet about vaccination, for example, about coronavirus, about 5G. I mean, these kind of, humans have always passed on silly stories, but there's so many of them now, and it's so easy for them to spread very quickly.
You'd think there'd be fewer because people have got a phone in their hand and they can fact check. That idiot in the pub that tells you something and you used to go like, oh, is that a fact? And you walk away going, I'm not sure about that. Now you can just go, nah, he's talking bollocks. But you would think it would have gone the other way.
Well, it's all out there. Their truth is out there, as you say in our old sci-fi series. But, look, we're all pressed for time. We live in an attention-poor world. We all suffer a bit from attention deficit disorder in a way, which is, there's just so much going on. Sifting through stuff is actually quite difficult. And it's particularly difficult for the harder thinking. And so the bloke in a pub who does that, who's got a friend whose brother was in the Navy with somebody who once heard, whatever. We've all heard those kind of stories. But there's a lot more of it. And the trouble is, some of it comes from people you trust. I mean, occasionally, I don't know if it happens to you, somebody I know passes something on and says, what do you think of this? And my immediate response is, where did you get this? What, who sent you this? Why am I reading this? Which seems on the face of it nonsense.
It's a great podcast series. It's called The Big Steal. You mentioned we're all time poor, and I know you are, and thanks for your time so far. What are you working on right now?
Right. I got a new book that I'm trying to write very quickly. I can't really tell you the details about it just yet, but I'm hoping to get on with it. I'm hoping that coronavirus means that books are still able to be bought in bookshops when I hope I finish it in time for publication before Christmas. But who knows? So that's taking up quite a lot of my time. So actually, although like everybody else, I wish the coronavirus would just go away, we'd find a vaccination and so on. Being banged up, having to write means I am getting on with it.
Well, I'll let you crack on and get on with it. Gavin Esler, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for being on the Pod 20.
Not at all. Thank you. It's been a joy.